here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin with the fast approaching U.S. election. Democrats kicked off their party convention on Monday with a focus on what went wrong under President Trump's watch. The four-day meeting was switched online because of coronavirus infection risks. As Republicans currently hold the presidency, their convention will be held after the Democrats. The GOP gathering is set for August the 24th to the 27th. With the two sides gearing up for a confrontation at the polls, how big is the impact of raging pandemic and diverse U.S. foreign policy on this election? We invited guests from both parties and also neutral observers, all from the United States, to discuss several key issues in their country. For more on the U.S. election in Chicago, we have Laura Schwartz, a political commentator who worked at the White House during the Clinton era. In Iowa City, Professor Timothy Hagel, professor of political science at the University of Iowa. And in Washington, D.C., Brandon Andrews, an entrepreneur and former Capitol Hill staffer. Welcome to all of you. A lot going on inside the United States. Certainly, the election is on top of the agenda. Democrat convention going on. What does that mean for the start of a real election fight? Professor Hagel.
Well, it's hard to say what the conventions are going to mean this time, given that the Democratic one now and the Republican one next week are going to be mostly virtual. And certainly from the first night of the convention, viewership was down. That's not surprising for a couple of reasons. Again, partly because it's virtual, but also people are concerned about other things at this point. But it does signal sort of the start to the campaign. Usually I say that Labor Day holiday, the first Monday in September here, is usually the kind of the time when a lot of people that haven't been paying attention to politics are starting to pay attention to politics. And so this is when things will ramp up. They've seemed pretty intense so far, but they're going to get even more intense as we move forward.
Oh, absolutely. We've already hearing coming from a speech by the former First Lady, for example, former First Lady Michelle Obama did rally Democrats in her keynote address on Monday night that has been played over and over again at various media, particularly the liberal media. He said, quote, "Donald Trump is the wrong president for our country. He cannot meet his moment. He simply cannot be who we need him to be for us." A lot of attack one can expect from the Democrats toward the Republicans, particularly about this president. Mr. Andrews, you were working for the Republican senators at the Capitol Hill earlier. Tell me more about what does it mean, you know, the start of the Democrat convention for the real fight between the two parties?
Democrats are starting the convention with a lot of energy, and they've also recruited some prominent Republicans, to include Meg Whitman, who ran for Senate in the state of California as a Republican, and also John Kasich, who had a brief run for president, and of course has been and won election statewide in the state of Ohio. I've been wary of the president's ability to carry a ticket. I think a lot of Republicans that are going to be down ballot come November are going to be running away from President Trump, whether it's because of his response to the pandemic or because of statements that he's made about some of the movements that we've seen, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, or because of some of his obfuscation around mail-in voting and absentee voting. I think a lot of Republicans are going to be running away from President Trump instead of running towards him if they want to be able to win successfully in November.
For his part, President Trump tweeted that he wouldn't be in the beautiful White House today if it weren't for the job done by her husband in response to Michelle Obama, former President Barack Obama. Mr. Trump ended with a sarcastic thanks to Mrs. Obama for her very kind words. Now, this is nothing new in terms of political fights. Mr. Schwartz, you were working in the White House earlier. You know that. Tell me more about both sides. What do you think are some of the convincing points, particularly from the Democrats this time?
It's really exciting because this is the commencement of the election ahead. I've either been orchestrating from behind the scenes or covering every DNC and RNC since 1996. And this is the platform of which both parties get to explain what they want to do, why they want to do it, and how they feel they can do it better. So the Democrats this week are really focusing in on uniting America. That's their overall theme. Last night for Michelle Obama's speech, it was all around we the people. And it was very interesting because they brought in, and maybe the unconventional convention, which is virtual, is allowing them to do this a little bit more than other years. They've brought in Americans from all across the country, as Brandon mentioned, Republicans as well as Democrats, independents, those that are undecided, to ask them what matters to them. And now it's going to be up to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the rest of the speakers in the next few nights to say, hey, this is how we're going to make that difference. This is how we are going to rise to the occasion, because they've got three things on their palette that they're really going to push this week. One, solutions to racial injustice, the global pandemic, and the bungled response that's led to this economic downturn. You're going to hear all three themes really resonate this week. As far as next week, we'll have to wait and see what the Republicans have in store.
I see. Professor Hagel, one of the most important things is what are really on the minds of voters in the United States right now, how to prioritize them. That matters a lot to the politicians, and they need to provide what they perceive as the important solutions. Professor Hagel, how would you give that list?
What I usually talk about are what are called the kitchen table issues. So jobs, health care, and the economy more generally are the things that a lot of people, and particularly a lot of independent voters, or the voters in the ideological middle, really care about. They don't get caught up in a lot of the political infighting that often goes on in one way or another between Democrats and Republicans, and instead they focus on these sorts of things like what does this mean to me, or what does this mean to my friends on a very personal level. And that's the challenge that Democrats have this week, Republicans will have next week, in terms of saying how their policies will affect them in a good way. And of course, we see if the Democrats also need to attack the Republicans because they're working against an incumbent president, so they have to talk about, as they're perfectly willing to do, the things that they don't like about Trump and his policies.
Pandemic. Where is it on this list?
Well, the pandemic has touched literally everyone in this country. It's touched so many people around the world. So whether it's the economy, whether it's healthcare, whether it's issues of justice and access, all of those intersect with the pandemic, and the president's pandemic response, and Democrats will say his lack thereof, I think will play a significant part as we look at what voters are actually using to make the final decision at the ballot. And of course, the movements that we've seen around the country are also at the forefront of a lot of people's minds as well.
Right. About pandemic, Ms. Schwartz, what are the Democrats' talking points?
We've heard a preview from Joe Biden in the last few weeks. We'll hear much more this week. One on the economic side is being able to build back better, and his plan economically to get the country out of the slump caused by the response to the pandemic. You may recall back in the Obama administration, he headed up the economic recovery effort. And so I think that's something that he should focus more on. And then it's all about health care, as well as testing, contact tracing, and access to learning and broadband, which right now in America, everybody's going back to school. Or are they? A lot of people have gone virtual. Not everybody has the talents and the assets to do such. So you're seeing a lot of focus on the family, how this is affecting them, and how can they make it better.
Professor Hagel, how important this time is this public health issue, whether candidates are eligible to give their solutions now?
As was indicated, Vice President Biden talked about what he wanted to do. Didn't get into a lot of real details, which you wouldn't expect at this point, but he's laying out sort of the broad strokes for the plan, which of course is going to spend a lot of money in terms of the healthcare side of things, the testing side of things, and so forth, as was indicated. But one of the things that we really have to hope for is that they get a vaccine fairly soon, because if we don't, then it's a matter of, well, we try to do what we can to keep people from getting infected, but a certain number of people are going to be infected because a certain number of people just are going to be participating with other people who may be infected, carrying the disease and so forth. So we have to sort of do what we can in terms of mitigating the current situation, but look forward to a vaccine, and hopefully we'll find one fairly soon. But then you raise the question of, well, when we do get a vaccine, how quickly can it be distributed and who gets it first and so forth, and that's going to be sort of a political minefield unless the government officials in charge of that can come up with what seems to be a fairly fair way to distribute it as the number of doses are manufactured.
About this public health issue, it's going to be mind-boggling because it's going to eventually have a final say about where America is going, whether whoever is in the White House. So, Mr. Andrews, from the Republican Party's side, not just from the president in the White House, what are some of the plans do you see that are coming into form?
Republicans have to hope that those individual efforts by individual politicians that are down the ballot are going to help lift the overall view of the Republican Party in terms of response to the pandemic, because whether you're a Republican or Democrat at this point, if you just judge it on job approval for the pandemic, for the president and his administration, it is becoming even in places that are Republican strongholds, places that Donald Trump carried by significant margins back during the last election. Those folks are saying he hasn't done a good job, but Republicans are, I think, are placing their hopes on some of these other governors and local state elected officials who have taken the initiative. If the cumulative effect of some of these small state-level changes starts to lead to some progress, it could put the president in a much more competitive position come November. And so for Democrats,
very interesting.
It's important to not count the president out quite yet, because there is a possibility that something could turn around, and you've certainly seen Donald Trump's ability to seize on even small pieces of hope for a campaign in the past.
Yeah, but having said that, though, what about the economy? Professor Hagel, you talk about the kitchen table topic. Economy, of course, matters to everyone. This time it's complicated, not only the pandemic, but also the earlier signs of the global recession before even the occurs, and its impact on the United States, and the earlier fight this president in the White House picked up with China about trade and economic war, whether that has really brought the White House and the Republican Party any gains politically much at this time. All these are fascinating topics for an election, I would assume. Professor Hagel.
Oh, absolutely. And certainly before the pandemic hit, at the very beginning of this year, end of last year, the economy was looking pretty good, but that doesn't mean that there weren't points of criticism that Democrats would point to, in particular some of the relationships that we've had with our trading partners of various sorts, including China. But with the pandemic and putting the United States and other countries in a very difficult economic situation, it's basically going to make it that much more difficult for the president to herald the economy. But again, he has sort of done that to a certain extent, talking about a V recovery, meaning a very sharp decline followed by a very sharp recovery. People are going to argue about whether that's the case or not. Some aspects of the economy are good. The stock market is up, at least the NASDAQ and the Standard & Poor's are at the all-time highs today when they closed. But on the other hand, you know, in terms of that personal level, there are still a lot of people that are out of jobs or their work has been cut because of pandemic response.
Indeed.
And so, again, at the personal level, the kitchen table level, there's still a long way to go, and that's something that not just Donald Trump, but as was indicated, other Republicans as well, have to make that something that's an issue that they have to focus on as well.
We understand the two parties have not yet come to a conclusion about the relief effort for the next stage. What's going to happen with the two political conventions, and also the policy lines, talking points likely those candidates are likely to bring out during their conventions? Mr. Andrews.
Yeah, they're still deadlocked, and honestly, in some ways, there's as much daylight between Republicans in the Senate and Democrats in the House, as there is daylight between Republican presidential administration under Donald Trump and Senate Republicans, because the last impasse has really been there. I think with this package, wherever it lands, and I'll note that Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, has actually called the House back to vote on a bill to add some funding to the USPS to address some issues there, and you have to imagine that when a final package is passed, that'll likely be part of it as well, and that'll also politicize it a little bit more. It shouldn't be political, but it will. But overall, I think this package has to be more forward-looking than packages in the past. I think especially when you talk about small business, I'm an entrepreneur, so much of what has been done to stabilize and maybe keep afloat businesses that were currently existing.
Mr. Schwartz, the economy, of course, is going to be a big question mark for this president in the White House, even though the economy was doing quite well. But since the pandemic, it has been, the issue of dealing with the pandemic has been extended to such an extent that it's having a much bigger impact on the economy than it should be, some suggest. Ms. Schwartz, though, after this president, though, in the White House is proud of his economic record. So how shall we see the voters reconcile between his rhetorics and the current realities, particularly following the pandemic?
That's a very good question, and it really comes down to how you're going to communicate your message as a candidate and as a party down ballot as well. There's difference between Main Street and Wall Street, as we say in this country. And even those on Main Street weren't feeling the same economic high as those that were on Wall Street. And so it's bringing them back to a time where they still felt that things were tightening up even before the pandemic, and looking back at what President Trump really got behind in his term, which was tax cuts for the wealthiest of Americans and corporations. I think they'll be reminded of that throughout this election, and I think they want to hear how the economic recovery, whichever candidate is offering it, is going to help them. Because as Brandon alluded to, the House under Nancy Pelosi passed out another economic recovery plan, of which just stalled in the Senate, and there have been dismal negotiations at the White House. They'll come back and see if they can get maybe pieces done, but America is looking for a plan that fits them, no matter where they live around this country. Rural America and Main Street wants to know.
My final question, since we are broadcasting from China, a lot of people are extremely interested in how China-U.S. relations are evolving during this time, building up to an election in the United States. Usually, international issues, foreign policy issues matter, but not that much. But we have seen, if I could invite the expertise of Professor Hagel as a political scientist, that the president inside the White House right now is trying to bring the China factor into the overall election, try to make it a huge topic, probably even exceeding that of the pandemic and that of the economy, suggesting China play a bigger role in setting the U.S. agenda in a way. So, of course, that's an election tactic. People here understand that, but at the same time also frustrated about being manipulated. Will the topic of China really matter?
Well, as I explained to someone earlier today, our relationship with China had always been complicated in various ways. And I think that because of the pandemic and the way that President Trump has placed blame for it on China and has been looking at various Chinese companies and giving them sanctions or additional restrictions, that it's just the relationship has just become more complicated. It's still something that in certain respects we want to have a good relationship with China, the U.S. does, in terms of trade sorts of things. That's particularly the case for my state of Iowa in terms of selling our agricultural products and trade in that respect. But on the other hand, again, as you said, President Trump has tried to place a lot of blame for certain problems, the pandemic and other sorts of things on China. I don't know that that'll resonate very heavily with, again, the middle voters. Again, back to the idea that they care more about sort of the personal side of things. And they may say, yeah, okay, maybe China's at fault for one thing or another. Maybe we need to change our supply chains for certain things like medications or whatever it happens to be. But on the other hand, those people are going to say, look, but how does that affect me? How does that affect me directly? what is your plan? What are you going to do in terms of making things better rather than just placing blame here or there? So I think to a certain extent, Trump is playing that card to sort of antagonize the Democrats and also to show that maybe Biden has relationships with China and place blame there. So it's kind of an attack on him. But again, it's sort of that political gamesmanship that for a lot of the average voters, it's just not going to matter that much.
Interesting. And Ms. Schwartz, the same question to you. Now, of course, the candidate coming from the Democrat Party, Mr. Biden, has been attacked by his opponent about, quote unquote, having certain kinds of links with China. But by the way, who wouldn't, right? Even you, all of you are doing a show on China's TV. After all, these two largest economies in the world. Having said that, though, the election is more about politics. So, Ms. Schwartz, do you think, though, there is any concern coming from the Democratic Party about a relationship in which it's deteriorating in such a degree, day by day, between China and the United States? Will there be any chance the next president, if it's a Democrat, will be able to repair to a certain extent? Or this is just going to be a card dropped by this White House and likely have to be shouldered by all the others in the future generations?
I think no matter who wins the election this November, as with every country around the world and being the global economy and world leader that the United States is, they need to hold countries accountable. And whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, I think any president, especially a Joe Biden, is going to hold other countries accountable to a certain level.
Well, we also want the world to hold the U.S. accountable in terms of international platforms and mechanisms, and as well as international responsibilities, even about the pandemic. Having said that,
and I think, Joe, I think
yeah.
we'll hear more and more about that in the next, 78 days.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Mr. Andrews, final words from you, also about China briefly. How is that factor likely to be in the election?
Yeah, well, I definitely believe in partnership, have visited Shenzhen and Guangzhou and other areas, and believe that whether we like it or not, the two countries are intertwined very much so, and it'll be productive for us to continue to have open relationships, and when we can travel again, when we get over this pandemic, to begin to reintegrate in terms of sharing each other's cultures.
Right.
I will say that whether it's talking intellectual property or Huawei and potential national security issues, or Hong Kong and foreign affairs concerns, sovereignty concerns, or potential financial concerns, currency manipulation, there are a number of issues that need to be addressed by whoever is in leadership, whoever is going to be at the State Department and at the White House. However, I don't think any of those pieces are insurmountable in terms of the relationship continuing. And I certainly look forward to continue to stay connected to my friends in China as well.
Thank you. And we feel the same way with all our friends in America as well. One of the things probably we really urgently need to do is to have a channel to discuss about any of the issues you raised or any of the issues that the Chinese side also have in mind toward the United States. Having said that, though, I want to thank you for your insights about a fascinating but certainly one of the most important elections in your history. Thank you. Really appreciate Laura Schwartz, Brandon Andrews, and Tim C. Hagel. Thank you so much. And be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.